Everyone knows George Santayana's famous remark. Even if you don't know the name of George Santayana, those who do not remember history are condemned to repeat it. But of course, history never quite repeats itself, if only because the circumstances that we face in one day are never quite like those that we faced yesterday. As a historian, I've got a vested interest in the proposition that we can learn lessons from the past. But honesty compels me to say right at the beginning that the lessons that we learn are mostly cautionary rather than prescriptive. History can seldom tell us which path we should follow in the future, but I believe it can improve our thinking about how to choose the correct path. From childhood onwards, we're taught, aren't we, that we should learn from our mistakes. As I listened to Max in his talk, he used words like dismal, ill-planned, unfortunate, horrendous, mistakes it would appear. And I imagine that the Australian practitioners of one modest form of engineering, ball tampering, are pondering their mistakes right now and perhaps thinking about how they might mend their ways. Although I do notice that they'd only recently resolved to mend their ways before they got to South Africa. One of the best-known urban planners, and one of the best-known books on urban planning, is Great Planning Disasters by Sir Peter Hall, who died just recently. And in that book, he examines a series of planning mistakes ranging from London's motorways, San Francisco's BART system, the Anglo-French Concorde, and the Sydney Opera House, which he apparently enumerates among the mistakes, and draws lessons from today's planners. And he identifies three main sources of uncertainty which affect transport planning. Uncertainty about the environment or changes in the environment, uncertainty about the way in which systems outside the planning system impact upon us, and uncertainty about changing values. Looking back on the past half century, as we've been doing this evening, I imagine that we could point to a number of those forms of uncertainty. Consider, for example, changes in our assumptions about future population and economic growth. You could write an interesting study of the history of projected population for Melbourne. Right now we're in one of the optimistic phases. We're talking about 6 million or something. But we've gone through oscillations in that. You could also point to changes in our understanding of how increases in road capacity relieve or fail to relieve congestion. And finally, and perhaps most crucially, we could point to changes in people's values and attitudes towards the urban and suburban life that we live. In the 1960s, Hall remarked that we were looking forward to a future of ceaseless mobility in search of ever-widening changes, range of choice in jobs, education, entertainment, and social life. And by the time he wrote, he talked about how we now envisage the good life in terms of an almost reverse of that, in terms of small, place-bounded, face-to-face communities. There's been a big shift in our values. Now, to summarise what I believe about history, this is very quick, I'm going to say that I think it can be a valuable corrective to some narrowly technical approaches to transport planning, and telling us how things got to be how they are. It illuminates the taken for granted assumptions behind our way of life. By reviewing the chains of causation, historical causation, it gives us a better sense of the complex and often unforeseen interactions between changes, for example, in employment, family structures, residential patterns and transport. It gives insights into the effects of policies and decisions that seemed sound at the time, but turned out to be flawed. And it sensitises us to the importance of different timescales in the process of planning. And finally, it tells us something about what the present owes to the past and in turn what it might owe to the future. Looking back over the past century or so, I think we can identify many critical decision points in Melbourne's transport history, any one of which, if it had been resolved differently, might have set the city on a different path. I hesitate to describe all of these planning decisions as disasters because, as we'll see, some of the things that looked like as though they were disastrous at the beginning might have turned out to be more successful, and probably vice versa. One of the features of that history is a pattern of what economists call path dependence. Path dependence is the tendency for a pattern of decision making to become locked in and nearly irreversible. The political scientist Margaret Levy gave this useful definition. She says path dependence has to mean, if it means anything, that once a country or region started down the track, the costs of reversal are very high. There'll be other choice points, but the entrenchments of certain institutional arrangements obstruct an easy reversal of the initial choice. And she goes on to suggest that perhaps a better metaphor for that is to talk, although paths I think is probably the appropriate one for a group of transport engineers, but arborists I suppose might prefer the tree metaphor. From the same trunk there are different branches and smaller branches. Although it's possible to turn around or clamber from one branch to the other, and essentially if one branch dies, the branch on which the climber begins is the one that he or she tends to follow. So if we were to adapt that metaphor to Melbourne, I suggest we could trace a historical path that's led the city to its dominant pattern of low-density, suburban, automobile-dependent development. What were the critical decision points that led it along this path? How easy would it have been to turn back and retrace our steps along a different path, or attempt to move from one path or branch to another? One of the earliest of these critical decision points was the 1880s land boom, when Victoria's Chief Commissioner of Railways, Richard Speight, an Englishman accustomed to high standards and dense networks of British railway companies, and cheered on by log-rolling politicians, borrowed lavishly to construct a large part of what is still our present suburban railway system. You can see it here, the way in which it developed in that single decade, and it still bears a close resemblance to what we're all still familiar with. Under the so-called Octopus Act of 1883, the tentacles of rail extended to the farthest corners of the colony and to the most distant suburbs. In an era long before the days of cost-benefit analysis, both politicians and railway officials simply built the lines in the confidence that by advancing ahead of population they would encourage suburban development, and that the suburbs would eventually arrive to pay for the transport. Here's the suburbs arriving. Here's the typical suburban house with the railway always in the background. And here's what Richard Speight said blithely: within a radius of a few miles of Melbourne, there can be no mistake made in regard to the construction of those railways. Any line within 9 miles of Melbourne would play, so he said. Now, of course, it didn't quite turn out that way. In fact, at the end of this period, and just as he was speaking in 1891, Australia was on the brink of the Great Depression. And by 1894, it had all changed. This is some of the logic that underlay this, the Outer Circle line, which was designed originally as a way of trying to bring the Gippsland Government Railway into its Spencer Street terminal. And then, because people had bought land along the line, even though they'd solved the problem of bringing they'd amalgamated the two systems and solved the problem of bringing the rail into Spencer Street, they still went ahead and built the line. Here's Richard Speight with some of his mates inspecting the line. Now, by 1894, Commissioner Speight sued David Syme, the proprietor of the Age, for libel for the unkind things that they'd said about his railway plans. Speight was still unrepentant. Melbourne, he argued, was the finest suburban railway system in the world. And indeed, measured by per capita public transport patronage, he had more than a point. Historians have generally taken a dim view of Speight's apparently reckless policy, and in my own book I say unkind things about him. But the railways, of course, had to carry the debts of building that railway system well into the 20th century. And yet by building ahead of population, the railways had arguably endowed the city at lowest cost with a system that has continued to generate benefits right down to the present day. Building transport ahead of population now looks, doesn't it, a much wiser policy to a generation who are facing the horrendous cost of trying to catch up, of trying to retrofit the city with an adequate public transport system. Now, in reaction against the 1880s boom and the Depression, public transport policy in the early 20th century became pretty timid. An underground railway system was first proposed for the city, or not a system, but for a loop, was first proposed in the 1920s, included in the 29 transport plan that Max referred to, but was not, of course, built eventually until the 1980s. Advocates of the scheme argued that it was required to boost the flagging patronage on the rail system. It must be designed and routed so as to induce many more people than are at present doing so to to use the suburban rail system, they said in 1958. It was by far the most expensive new addition to Melbourne's public transport system that was included in the 69 transportation study. By the time it was completed in 1981, it had cost at least 10 times the initial £35 million estimate. A critical cost-benefit analysis by the Monash economist Stuart Joy was buried by the authorities because it was not thought to be what they wanted to hear. The expected boost to suburban railway patronage did not, of course, eventuate. You can see how patronage went through the 80s and 90s, until, of course, the last 10 years, when it has spectacularly increased. So the question I suppose I posed to you, was the loop an expensive mistake or a timely long-term investment? Only 10 years ago, the late Paul Lees was arguing that the problem of congestion it was designed to solve was an exaggerated one, and that a second loop, the present Melbourne Metro, was quite unnecessary. He appealed to the past to confound current policy and performance by showing, for example, that higher service frequencies had been achieved under the pre-loop, unprivatised system than under the current one. While this is an ingenious and persuasive line of argument, it rests, of course, on the dubious assumption that the technological, economic and social conditions of the 1940s, when the old Victorian railways achieved those apparently superior levels of service frequency, were sufficiently like today's conditions to be able to draw reliable conclusions about the current and future functioning of the system. Now, to take you back again to that early 1920s period, at about the same time as the loop was first proposed, we also got the first proposals to extend both the railway system and the tramway system. I have to show you a map of the proposed extensions to the Melbourne tramway system, which we've had about a third to its current size. During the 1920s too, the government-owned rail and tram networks were locked in vigorous competition with private bus owners. The Victorian Minister for Railways at the time, the promising young politician called Robert Menzies, fearful of the threat to the government's transport monopoly, insisted that the licences to run private bus services could only be given to companies that operated feeder services to the main government-owned rail-based system. For almost that limitation, that system has remained almost to the present day. For almost a century, the most flexible form of urban public transport, the motor bus, has been locked into a path determined not by profitability, efficiency or the public interest, but by political expedience and the interests of the private bus companies, which, as we've seen only this very week, are continuing to fight vigorously to hold on to their franchises, even sometimes it seems not only against planning logic, but sometimes even against their own self-interest. The most fateful, however, of the paths taken by Melbourne in the post-war, in the last century, of course, has been the mighty surrender to the automobile that began in the post-Second World War period. As late as 1951, as you can see here, more Melburnians were walking or riding bikes to work than were driving or riding in cars, and vastly more than either of these groups were using trains, trams and buses. In less than 30 years, the proportion of car commuters rose from under 20% to almost 80%. So disastrous does this mass conversion to the car now appear to some environmentalists that they frequently assume that only massive conspiracy on the part of the motor manufacturers and oil companies could explain it. In my book, Car Wars, I argue that Melbourne's surrender to the car was predisposed by many factors, and most of them perfectly rational against the values of the time. These included the rundown state of the public transport system, inherited from earlier times, as well as the inherent attractions of automobility to a city that was already set on a path towards full suburbanisation. So this is the era of the triple-fronted brick veneer and the Holden car, package that Donald Vaughan nicely summed up when he talked about Australia as the first suburban nation and the lucky country. The two things were almost the same thing. Was there ever a moment, I wonder, when Melbourne could have been said to have reached a fork in the road and chosen to go down that path? Now, transport policy, for the most part, had been gradual and incremental, with 20th century highways often following a similar path to 19th century railways. I mean, Max, you mentioned the corridors that were identified by the creek and river valleys. So here's the demand for suburban living in 1951. Here's the creek and river valleys, identified in the 29 Metropolitan Plan, not as an ideal place for electricity pylons or for roads, but for recreational areas. Something that might now be forgotten. But if you look at the configuration of the road system that emerged after the Second World War, you can see how very closely it aligns with those creek valleys. So they fall quite naturally into the radial pattern determined by physical geography, the Yarra and its tributaries, technology, because the optimal curves and gradients for railways and freeways were similar to those of the valleys. Economics, it was cheap government land. It was easier for the government to build on Crown land than it was to have to pay for land elsewhere. And political prudence, the recognition that invading human neighbourhoods was riskier than upsetting the frogs in the valleys. Attempts to override this pattern, like the 69 plan, I don't think I've got it there for you, really largely failed. And the bits that failed of the 69 plan were not the radial components, but it was those box components that Max was mentioning before as a typical part of the transport plan. I'll have a map to show you that in a moment. Now, I come back to that question, was there ever a moment, and I'm grateful, Ray, for mentioning Colin Buchanan, because he's going to enter the story in a moment. In 1964, the Royal Automobile Club of Victoria hosted a conference on the theme of living with the motor car. Most of the Melbourne's movers and shakers were there, including state and city officials. They are addressed by two visiting experts, the American highway expert, Burton Marsh. Sorry, poor picture of you, Burton, but you will see he is honoured as the most honoured man in the ITE, of your counterpart organisation in the United States. He was a breezy advocate of the American model of freeways and drive-ins. And on the other side was this man, Colin Buchanan, who, as Ray's told us, had the conviction that it was necessary to curb and tame the car if civilised urban life was to survive. Burton Marsh arrived in Melbourne early, and he spent a couple of weeks touring the country and meeting local officials. He was a confident, fluent presenter who illustrated his talk with lots of slides and movies. Colin Buchanan, on the other hand, arrived only hours before his talk, obviously exhausted from the long pre-jet aeroplane journey, and so disoriented that he jokingly admitted his surprise to find that the locals actually spoke English. Before he knew what he'd said, or indeed even before he'd really had time to look around, the diffident Englishman had capitulated to the breezy charm of the American co-presenter and conceded that Australia, as a new world society, was bound to follow the same path as the United States. Theorists of path dependence might say that large consequences can often follow from small and accidental only decisions. So suppose Colin Buchanan had got on an earlier plane and looked a bit further before he opened his mouth, or Burton Marsh had arrived late and his slide projector had broken down like he did. Would Melbourne's leaders have plotted a different path into the future? Probably not. For by then, there were many currents already running strongly in the condition advocated by Burton Marsh. But the writings of Colin Buchanan, as I think Ray's illustrated, provide us with the outlines of an alternative counterfactual path that Melbourne might have followed. One that might have preserved more of the human scale and historic charm of the 19th century city and forestalled some of the cruder attempts to remake it in an American model. Within 5 years of this encounter, Melbourne had committed itself firmly to the Burton Marsh recipe. The 69 plan, which you can see here, was 300 miles, 500 kilometres of freeways, was probably the most influential transport plan in Melbourne's history. I don't have time here this evening to analyse all of its content. If you want to, buy my book, Car Wars, and you'll find how I explore it. But yeah, what I say of it was that it was in many ways what I call a Faustian bargain. That's to say, it led us down a path which seemed benign at the time, whose fortunate consequences, or unfortunate consequences, its creators did not, perhaps could not fully anticipate. Recognising the path dependencies that have brought Melbourne to its current vulnerable position is a useful antidote to the utopian tendencies of some urban and environmental planners. It reminds us that we can't reinvent the city afresh, but we have to plot a path into the future that recognises the costs of moving back or forward along the path we've already been following, or more radically, trying to jump from one branch to another. One of the most influential analyses of the relationship between urban form and automobile dependencies is famous graph, the variation of it, from Newman and Kenworthy, depicting the allegedly linear relationship between urban sprawl and automobile dependence. At the virtuous end of the graph, of course, are the places, the high-density, low auto-dependent cities like Hong Kong and Paris, while at the vicious end of the low-density, automobile-dependent cities like Dallas and Houston. Melbourne, of course, is somewhere in the middle. You can see it somewhere here. But he would argue too close to Houston for comfort. If only we were as densely built as these other cities, Newman implies, we could support transport systems like these too. This is the logic that underlies a lot of current strategic planning, Melbourne 2030 and so on, and the push for higher residential densities around the fixed rail system. However, it takes little account of the historical paths that led us to these different points on the graph, all the potential costs and benefits of attempting to move from the path we're on to another. Faced with the massive costs of exchanging one transport paradigm for another, it might be sensible to modify the pattern that we've already got with well-crafted adaptation in the style of Crosby Cannon, rather than radically overturning it. Right now, Melbourne is going through one of its most profound transformations in its history. Rapid population growth, high levels of skilled migration, especially from Asia, the decline of manufacturing and the recentering of the metropolis around the knowledge economy, not to mention the twin threats of resource depletion and climate change, pose challenges that were completely unforeseen in the 1950s and 60s. The social map of the new Melbourne is very different from the one that was foreseen in 1954. You can see now, in those days, the place to live was on the edge. Now, of course, the place to live increasingly is seen to be in the centre. So, oddly enough, in this map, the greenest parts of the city are in the centre rather than on the fringe. The social map of the new Melbourne then is almost an inversion of the old, with the most desirable places now in the centre. History of itself cannot tell us what we should do about these challenges, but in telling us how we actually got to where we are, it broadens our understanding of the complex range of factors that bear upon the path we choose for tomorrow. It informs our sense of what is determined and what is contingent in the evolution of the system. It sensitises us to those different timescales that are involved in decision making. And by demonstrating the long-term consequences of sometimes poorly considered decisions, it may also reinforce our awareness of the heavy obligation that transport planners bear for the welfare of future generations. Thank you.